At this place in history with the Vermont Historical Society. Steve Perkins with me again. Steve, where are we right now?
So we're at a ferry landing in Isle La Motte, and we have to think back in time when these really were islands in the lake, and the only way to get back and forth to both the islands and to New York was via ferry. So there's a Rouse's Point Bridge and the North Hero Bridge and all these, and the sandbar. But you know, even like 100 years ago, you couldn't get from upstate New York to Vermont really easily because there was no way to do it. So you had to take ferries. So lots of little ferries cropped up to go across the islands. And we're at a point where one of the last ferries to run this route was located before that Rouse's Point Bridge was put in.
And this is called Sweet's Ferry. We're going to meet some Sweets?
We're going to meet some Sweets. So the guy who owned it was Mr. Sweet, and so we have two of his grandkids here. And I'm really excited for them to talk about what it meant to them to have that ferry here.
Down here by the water now, and I have a couple of Sweets of Sweet's Ferry fame. Thank you guys so much for joining me. So what does this spot mean to your family?
Well, our grandfather built a ferry, and this is the Vermont side where the ferry boat landed. It began at Chazy Landing and came across here to Isle La Motte.
And so this was called, the ferry was called the Twins? Why is that?
In 1904, he bought the ferry, and in 1905, he built the Twins, which was named after my father and her father, which were twins that were born right there in Chazy Landing.
Why was the ferry important to the people of this area?
This was the only crossing in northern New York and Vermont. There was no bridges on this part of the lake. So the traffic was starting to start as far as tourists and transport and so forth. So the ferry came from here, or from Chazy Landing to here. And it was called the Chazy Landing Ferry. It's the sign up there says Sweet's Ferry because a lot of the people knew it as Sweet's. And Will Sweet was very well liked and famous in those days. So they all called it Sweet's Ferry on this side of the lake.
And there were a lot of dignitaries that rode on the ferry?
Absolutely, and one of the reasons they did ride on the ferry is that my grandfather did some wonderful advertising with signs from here almost down to New York City, and he developed these strip maps to show people how to get to Chazy Landing and how to get to Isle La Motte to use the ferry. And then Eleanor Roosevelt and how many other people?
In those days, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Burroughs typewriter and so forth, they would travel from the Adirondacks. They would be on camping trips with whole caravans of tents and everything. And they would be traveling to Maine, to the Bar Harbor area. And they would cross the ferry almost every year. And then there were other people like Gene Tooney, the fighter, Theodore Roosevelt apparently crossed on it. Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt crossed on the ferry. So a lot of people crossed, and governors and so forth of all the states up here crossed on this ferry. It was the only route to all of New England, the Boston area, on the northern part of the lake.
It's so fascinating hearing the personal stories here.
I know, and this is a real family story, but then that linkage to Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, all these people who landed right here where we're standing, because that's how they had to get from one side of the lake to the other. Really cool.
Another great place in Vermont history.